Thanks very much, Jan, and a big thanks to Montgomery Parks and of course also KC Trees for hosting this tree summit and for inviting me to speak to you. And it's a bit speaking to you, obviously, because of course we're still in these conditions where we're not able to be in the same room, but I'm hopeful that that's going to happen very soon again. And I have pretty big shoes to fill because we've had two excellent talks by Carly Zeter, and I'm actually going to refer to some of Carly's work later. And then also, of course, by Kevin Smith, a very passionate story about some of those fantastic fungi that we've seen on our trees. So it was really inspirational, I think, to hear these two talks. So my talk kind of maybe picks up on some of these issues. And I think Carly was already mentioning about the need to kind of scale up some of that thinking, some of that research, some of those best practices in urban forestry and try to see how can we actually really enhance the relevance of our field. How can we mainstream urban forestry in a time, of course, when we are living in quite challenging times? I don't have to tell you, of course, things like climate change, the current pandemic, but also in general, the public health challenges we're facing, biodiversity loss. There's a lot of things happening around us, as well as the continuing push towards cities. And globally, this is really a trend where people are moving to cities. So it means, of course, there's more and more focus on these beings, on trees, and on the role that these trees play in providing us with good places, healthy places, biodiverse places to live, work, and play. This is a plane tree in my home country, in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam in this case. And the amazing thing with trees is, of course, and we saw some beautiful images earlier as well, that they can really shape, one being can shape a whole room, a whole place in a city. And I've been fascinated by trees and by urban woodlands, urban parks, basically all my life. And one of the things I've always been doing, even when I was not an urban forester, is to experience cities, experience the urban forest on foot and trying to move around the city and trying to get a feel for it. So before I moved to Barcelona, a city you can actually see a little park of behind me, I was living in Vancouver in British Columbia, which is of course another beautiful green city. So this is a typical Pacific Northwest city scene, I guess, with a lot of big trees, some of them native, some of them exotics. We heard some talks about that earlier as well. And of course, places like that shape their own histories with trees and with urban forests. So one of the first books I came across moving to Vancouver a few years ago was actually the Vancouver Tree Book. This is really a nice effort by David Tracy in this case to connect those tree stories with people's stories and to give people an idea of what are the trees, what is the urban forest they are living with. And Vancouver, like many cities, is fortunate that it has a pretty decent urban forest cover. And this is taken from Queen Elizabeth Park towards the North Shore Mountains and the downtown area. And a little bit depending where you take the picture in places like Vancouver, you can actually show the city to be a forest. So you would be maybe a bit surprised to realize that Vancouver doesn't have a canopy cover that extends 20%, right? Which is pretty low compared to many other North American cities. But still, of course, there are elements, there are parts of the city that are really nice and green. And I wrote a little piece about kind of my engagement with the urban forest and with the city, also at the time when I was planning my move back to Europe, to Barcelona, because really engaging with my surroundings and engaging with the urban forest helps me also to connect to places and to also, in this case, say farewell to places. And then on the other end, of course, coming to the other side of it, it's also saying hello and starting to acquaint myself with my new city. In this case, Barcelona, an iconic city in Europe, of course, known for its beautiful architecture, its cultural history, but actually also with a pretty decent urban forest. And maybe not so much in the city itself, because it's a very dense city, of course, a historical city, but especially on the hillsides, when you go up from the seaside up towards the north, you will see some very nice forested areas. And actually also the Montjuic forest area is pretty central to the city. And then walking the streets here in Barcelona, of course, the image is a little bit different from a place like Vancouver. You will see much more focus on this kind of street landscapes, I should say, or what they call the Ramblas in Spain. So you have these areas where there's a median, a tree median, where a lot of the public and social life is actually playing out. And during the pandemic, Barcelona was really suffering as one of the cities that was hit hardest in the initial phases of the pandemic. So one of the things the city started to accelerate is to reclaim some public spaces from the car habitat. So for example, you see here on the left, the street I'm living, they started painting part of the street yellow, put these concrete blocks in, and started claiming it as public space. And then, of course, also sometimes you run into some barely surviving specimens of trees, but they're clinging on in this sometimes pretty harsh urban environment. And of course, here the weather is another factor. It gets very dry here in summer. And even though maybe the number of trees in Barcelona is not always so big, depending a bit where you go, there is a very strong link to trees and forests. And some of you may have come across the work of the famous Catalan architect Antoni Gaudi, who of course famously started designing and building the Sagrada Familia Catholic Church, which is still not finished, although the work started in the 1880s. But one of the things that was really inspiring Gaudi were actually trees. So if you go into the Sagrada Familia today, and it's reopened again after the initial lockdown, you will actually see that a lot of these pillars that he shaped that are carrying the high ceiling are actually tree-like. So they're really shaped like trees. And then, of course, also wherever you go and you have the meeting places, the cafes, trees are always part of the streetscape. So we're fortunate in that sense, of course, that even though maybe we're not always mainstreaming urban forest per se, not everywhere in the world, we have seen the history of many cities that have developed pretty nice and pretty green connections between buildings, between infrastructure, between culture, but then also interspersed with trees and urban forest, or maybe with blue infrastructure, like here in the case of Stockholm in Sweden. Other places, of course, are less lucky. This is Hong Kong in China, right, where you have actually parts of the city that are very, very dense and where it's very difficult to find a tree. But one would maybe be surprised that a place like Hong Kong has more than 50% green cover, actually, mostly in its country parks that are also functioning as the city's watersheds. And then moving to global south, places like Guayaquil, Ecuador, of course, the whole urban forestry discussion becomes a completely different one. In these unplanned favelas, the informal settlements, you see the trees, of course, here and there people have maintained the trees, but it's very difficult here to have a strategic, a planned approach to urban forestry. So, of course, I'm not telling most of you anything new to kind of reiterate what we mean with urban forestry, but interesting enough, when I travel around the world and work in different cities, there's still quite some discussion. What do we mean? What do we imply with urban forest? Are we only talking about forest ecosystems? Are we only talking about street trees? Or are these all, of course, matched up together in this big social-ecological system we call the urban forest? So it's always good to kind of understand it from my perspective. I definitely look at the full urban forest that I know in many North American cities is also perceived like that. So including street trees, park trees, woodlands, but also, of course, private gardens. And we heard Carly talk present a very interesting study about seeing what is the diversity, for example, in people's private gardens. Urban forestry is a rather new field. Many of you will probably know that it was, of course, the professor in Toronto, Jurgensen, who originally coined the term urban forest in the 1960s. But when you start digging into the history of city greening and city woodlands and city forests, etc., there's hundreds of years of history. So one of the things I came across when I was doing my master's in the Netherlands is this story about the Haagse Bos, or the Hague Forest, which was a forested area close to the city of The Hague, where the International Court of Justice is located. It's owned by Prince of Orange, William of Orange, who was also the founding father of the Netherlands. So at the moment when he was starting to fight against the Spanish to start creating an independent republic, he really lacked the money to pay for his army, which was often, of course, comprised of mercenaries. So one of the things he looked at was actually his little piece of forest there, this city forest called the Haagse Bos. And he had the idea to cut the trees and from the income maybe start paying his soldiers. But he didn't count on the people of The Hague, who were really heavily against this and started arguing that, hey, come on, this is our forest. We go here. This is part of our city, right? This is really the strong relation, symbiosis between city and forest. So they melted the church bells, which at that time were silver bells, and actually gave that to William. In return, they then expected a promise that the forest would be kept. So as early as in 1570s, William of Orange then wrote famously this Act of Redemption, as it's known, stating that for now and forever, the city forest of the Haagse Bos would belong to the people of The Hague. So in a way, urban forestry, optima forma, 400 plus years ago. So we're actually not talking always about such new phenomena when we talk about urban forest and the engagement of communities. So that's history. And of course, today we are in this pretty challenging time. There's no doubt about it. And we've all, of course, on an individual basis, a personal basis, really experienced the challenges. And there's some of these big challenges like climate change, water scarcity, biodiversity loss, overall health challenges that have to do with non-communicable diseases, as we call them, poverty in large parts of the world. And then there's some very direct, immediate changes or challenges like the COVID pandemic, but also extreme weather events, forest fires, as well as conflicts that are occurring on a regular basis. So rather than to sit in our corners and be very depressed and negative about it, of course, we can also try to see, okay, are the opportunities here for bringing the urban forest into the fold, to actually connect it to these big agendas, these big challenges. And that's actually what we see happening. And I'm pretty excited about it because in my career as an urban forestry academic and also consultant and teacher, I think this is the moment in time where I've seen the greatest emphasis, the greatest attention for urban trees and urban forests. We're really becoming part of some of these very big discussions on things like adapting cities to climate change, promoting better health and well-being, conserving biodiversity also where people live, children's education. So there's really some kind of perfect storm emerging that actually puts urban forest and urban green space in the center of attention, even of high-level politicians. So there's a real appreciation of nearby nature. And obviously we know a lot about what nature can do, green infrastructure can do for adapting cities to climate change. And of course it's helped here that the research is getting better and better. We heard Carly's research earlier, some really convincing work, for example, on the cooling effect of the urban forest. And similarly, on the public health side of things, we know a lot now about what the impact is of different types of urban forest on different types of health and well-being. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So we see a mainstreaming of urban nature. It's no longer just nice to have urban nature, urban trees. It's really necessary. And this is something that starts playing out in concepts like nature-based solutions. But also, I would argue, that will actually have to be taken further into a nature-based thinking approach. And I'll get back to that in a second. But in that situation, of course, we need people who are very skilled, who are very professional. We need to have state-of-art methods and knowledge. We also have to have good governance and leadership, obviously. So that really puts some emphasis on the need for education, training, and capacity building. So, of course, I'm not telling anything new when I say that we know, of course, that trees are good in many ways, and there's a lot of good evidence for it. We've heard quite a lot about it. There's some really nice infographics, for example, produced by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN here on the left. We did an infographic for the Urban Tree Diversity or the Urban Forestry Conference in Vancouver 2018. And there's a lot of these nice sound bites. And I know that the hosting organizations here today, they also do a lot of that communication work. Like, what are the benefits of urban trees? How can we package that in easy sound bites? Because that's sometimes something people are looking for. And there's also quite a lot of focus then on trying to see, okay, well, these benefits are great and we know all the benefits of trees, but how are we making sure that actually everybody gets the benefit? How can we be equitable? How can we make sure that canopy covers are evenly distributed? And again, Dr. Sieter earlier was already referring to that, right? That we're not always very good in spreading those benefits in an equal way, but there's more and more focus on that aspect as well. I already mentioned the research is getting stronger and stronger, and some of the outcomes are maybe slightly surprising. So of course we know that parks and green spaces are good for our physical health, and we know that if we live closer to green spaces, we're more physically active, which also then enhances our physical and mental health and well-being. But one of the things that has come up pretty strongly recently is that the visible green, so actually the trees we can see from our direct living or working environment, is very, very important. So it actually has been shown to have strong impacts on our mental health and well-being, but also on things like creativity, the way we perform in our work, etc. And that aspect has not always been covered very well, right? We have been tending to look at things like canopy cover and maybe also access to parks and other good green spaces. But how about the visible access to green? Does everybody have good access to, for example, trees from where they are living? Some of these aspects are covered by work that was done at the University of British Columbia by people like Emily Rugo. And also some really nice work was summarized by a journalist called Florence Williams. If you're interested in this whole idea of nature and health, her book is highly recommendable, The Nature Fix. It really does a great job in summing up some of the research and also really linking it up to some of the urgent issues that we have in today's society. So here's Carly. I returned the favor. I saw she showed my picture as well. So here we go. And her study, of course, was really excellently introduced by the author herself. But really one of the interesting things that I picked up from Carly's work is this sharp threshold, right? That if you have a canopy cover that hits 40% and goes over it, you see a really steep increase in the cooling effect of the urban forest. And that's interesting, right? It's not a linear relation. That means actually you can really achieve considerable cooling impacts. And many of you will know that American forests for a long time had the recommendation to have a 40% canopy cover in cities. They then stepped away from that, realizing that, of course, cities are extremely different. And it will make a big difference if you're in Washington, D.C., or you're in Portland, Oregon, or you may be in Phoenix, Arizona, to see if 40% tree cover is realistic. We're not talking about 40% vegetation cover, right? That could be a different story here. But it's interesting because it actually starts showing then in the literature, there's things popping up that actually could start giving us some ideas also in terms of guidance of planning and guidance of management as well. Some other really interesting work that has been done relates then to the distance people should have to the nearest green space. And I realize that we're working in metrics here, so like Carly, I'm using the metric scale. But it's not that different, of course, from US yards, for example. So work that was promoted by the World Health Organization and others really shows that a 300-meter distance is kind of a threshold, right? So if people live more than 300, maybe 500 meters away from the nearest public park, they're much less inclined to use it. And it turns out in research, for example, done in Denmark, that if people live 500 meters away or even a kilometer away, you see significant drops in their activity level, but also in their physical health, in things like obesity. So that means basically, if you turn that around, that you have to cater for green spaces where people live. You have to make sure that wherever people are, they have easy access. And that, of course, also means you have to think about different groups, because some people are less mobile than others. You have to think about small children. How can we ensure also that these people have good access to green recreational opportunities? And of course, obviously, the whole climate change agenda is huge here. The idea of shading, cooling, both, of course, the shading effect of trees, which is probably the main impact, but also the evapotranspiration effect of trees. And here you see a picture from Dubai where workers are in construction, often immigrant workers from, for example, from Southeast Asia. And they are outside trying to find a little bit of cooling in this 50 centigrade plus temperatures that are prevailing. Those of you who are interested in soccer know that the World Cup is going to be held in Qatar. Qatar, of course, has extreme summer heat conditions. And allegedly, thousands of workers, mostly immigrant workers, have died during the construction of the football stadiums. This, of course, raises some really important human rights issues. But it shows also that, of course, you cannot just rely on air conditioning for cooling these kind of cities. Large parts of the world actually are facing extreme heat. And these days, you don't have to live in Dubai or Riyadh to face extreme heat, as we know. You can also live in a place like Vancouver or the inland British Columbia cities where we hit 40 plus centigrade, up to 45 or even higher inland British Columbia with our extreme temperatures. And many European cities have seen very similar challenges, also resulting, as we know from work in Vancouver, in hundreds of people per city that have died, additionally to usual death rates. So, of course, it's very clear that the COVID pandemic has really put our eyes and our nose on the fact that we need these local green spaces, right? We need to have green close to where we live because it really has been a retreat for us, a relief from all the stress, from all the challenges of the COVID pandemic. And places like Barcelona, people were not allowed to go to the local parks. But luckily, in places like Vancouver, local parks and beaches stayed open, under, of course, restrictions and asking people to physically distance, etc. And I'm absolutely sure that when we will start studying this years in the future, you will see differences in the health of people that were faced with these different types of conditions. Those people are actually able to still go out to nature and local parks, and those people didn't have the chance to do so. Physical health, but of course also in terms of mental health impacts. And the effects were, of course, dramatic. Those places where people were allowed to go to parks and forests, as soon as the lockdown hit, for example, here in Cologne, Germany, you see rapid spikes of all kinds of recreational activities in forest and green spaces. So we, in some cases, saw increases of 70% or so in our green spaces of recreational use. And interesting enough, a lot of that use was actually, a substantial part of that use was actually about people that were using parks and forests for the very first time. This was very interesting. So it actually opened a relation to new people as well. Now, other benefits, of course, I don't have to tell you, you're probably all very aware of it, but things like water, right? The protection of our drinking water. We know that at least 40%, maybe close to 50% of the world's largest cities are directly dependent on their peri-urban, urban forests for protecting of their drinking water resources. But also increasingly talking about the connection between urban forest and food, now coined under this term of food forestry, where actually there are opportunities also to provide not only social meeting places, but also actually addition to people's diets. And we know that in some cities in North America and elsewhere, we talk about food deserts, areas where people have very little access to fresh food, for example, because there are no fresh food supermarkets. So there could be really interesting opportunities here to use community gardens and food forests to supplement some of that. So we also did quite some work in the past on urban forest and children. And this is a little bit older work now from the 2010s by a PhD student, former PhD student called Inger Leerstrup, who used to be a kindergarten teacher in Denmark and was really interested in the difference between children who had access to nature on a daily basis and children who didn't. So she actually studied two groups. One group was going to a regular kindergarten, children between 3 and 6 years old, and then the other group was going to so-called forest kindergarten. And these are really cool phenomena if you haven't come across them, but actually it means that children are dressed up by their parents in the morning. They're often bussed out to a local forest area, and then they're not allowed to go inside. So they're outside, rain or shine, all day. And initially, of course, many of those kids are not very happy, but then they really get into it. And when comparing these two groups, Inger found that actually the group that was out in the forest was much more creative, developed much better motor skills, was less aggressive, was more social. So there was really a very clear difference between kids that had access to nature and kids that didn't have access to nature. And of course, also urban forest and biodiversity have a very strong relation. This is work we did in China, in Shenzhen, led by a former PhD student called Seju Hao. He was really interested in birds, biodiversity of birds in urban forests, but especially in the soundscape. So he made these heat maps of where bird song, bird activity, singing activity was mostly occurring. And then he related that to, for example, vegetation structure, but also to things like disturbance. And an interesting phenomenon that was occurring, that many birds actually started adjusting their sound to the human noise. So the pitch would differ. So we see urban birds of the same species singing in different pitch than their counterparts would do in the countryside. So it's a really interesting work also related to urban biodiversity. And then, of course, I mean, we are, many of us are tree people, most of us are tree people. We're pro-tree, obviously, we want trees, we want green space. But we have to realize that for some people, trees can be scary. Or maybe for many people, at some stage in their lives, they might be afraid of trees. And there's associations, of course, in the media, right, in movies, but also in terms of the relation between urban nature and diseases like the Zika virus or the emergence of malaria in some southern European cities. So there's a fear sometimes among people. There could be wild animals. I saw the other day in Vancouver, in Stanley Park, there's been quite some issue around coyotes that are attacking joggers and moms and children. So this kind of cohabitation between people and wildlife, of course, is an issue that is getting more and more tricky as we encroach on wildlife's habitats. Where wildlife maybe sometimes is actually thriving in urban areas, we also have to find ways of managing those potential conflicts. And then, of course, however well we do, we heard Kevin talk earlier about managing some of those issues with trees, some of the safety issues, but still things can happen. And sometimes you can be really unlucky, like here in the case of Madeira, a Portuguese island, where one tree hit a group of worshippers and killed 13 people. And of course, one can imagine the discussion that then emerges, right? How do we take care of the safety of our trees? And unfortunately, and I'm always a bit hesitant to show this slide, but there's actually companies, legal businesses that try to capitalize on this kind of partly or largely irrational fear of trees. So this is a company that says, well, over 100 people get killed by trees every year. Please engage us, right, if you want to try to get compensation from trees being in danger. And of course, this is really skewing the discussion very much, because it's not really holding up in terms of all the benefits now versus the cost. And the costs are often actually people making mistakes and driving into trees, for example, rather than trees just falling over on people. And we know also from risk studies that the risk of being seriously wounded or killed by a shark is actually bigger than being killed by a tree. So it's still a very small risk, of course, in many cases, but still the public discourse can sometimes emerge around this trees as a danger. And then we have to realize that, as I said, some people are just simply not happy in nature, and they rather be inside, rather be avoiding bad weather, or maybe also, as you see in the picture here from Central Park in New York, just trying to avoid other people because they don't want to hang out with other people in parks. So I already hinted a little bit at this, right? The idea that we're actually entering, I think, a new era for urban forestry, a new era in the sense that urban forestry is being lifted towards a new kind of policy arena. There's more focus in connecting trees and nature to bigger issues. Where urban forestry in the old days was kind of in its own corner. It's nice to have trees, right? We needed shade trees and we needed green spaces. But it was not really something that featured in some of the larger discussions in cities. But I just threw together here some of the policies and documents at the global level, the European level in this case, the national level, the city level, that are in some way tying in trees, urban forest, urban nature into some bigger picture discussions. Things like the Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations that have one specific SDG, number 11, on cities. And that goal actually calls for universal access to green space for everybody, wherever you live in the world. But also the United Nations Decade on Restoration that's calling for not just protecting nature, but for restoring ecosystems. And one of the ecosystems in focus for the next 10 years is going to be urban ecosystems. Many European initiatives like the nature-based solution strategies. And then we see cities like Melbourne and London pushing urban forestry really as a tool for overall city development. In the case of London, this actually meant that the city declared itself a national urban park a few years ago, recognizing the natural heritage the city has with over 52% of green spaces, and the link that exists between nature on the one hand, but also culture and economic development on the other. And actually many countries, like my own country, the Netherlands, they're actually releasing policies and strategies that are increasingly giving attention to the urban component of forests, for example. Yeah, so this was the National Park City idea in London, which is inspired by a slow wave that we see now of cities and countries implementing national urban parks. Sweden was one of the first in Stockholm, and Finland followed and actually rolled out a few. Toronto with its Rouge National Park. And actually now in Canada, there's a national program of setting up new urban national parks. And it takes this idea of national parks as something which is far away, is purely wild nature. It takes it into the city and shapes it into a new, I think, interesting concept, which is much more integrating nature and culture, diversity, biodiversity and cultural diversity. So it really provides new avenues, I think, not only for connecting people and nature, but also for raising these issues up to a higher policy level. Many of you have probably also come across this idea of nature-based solutions, which is a term that maybe 10 years ago nobody was using, but all of a sudden this came up as a big policy-related term, especially in Europe, but also now globally. And the idea is really here that we say, well, what can nature do to help us with dealing with all these challenges? Some of the challenges I outlined earlier. So nature can actually provide us with solutions. And the good thing with nature and trees is that actually, if they offer one solution, they will also offer other solutions. Right? Think about climate change, and then also having health benefits, biodiversity benefits, etc. And of course, it's a green approach to improving cities, rather than maybe just relying on engineering solutions or very high artificial solutions, which of course makes it very attractive. So this whole idea of the green economy and the green recovery also after COVID-19 is really a prevailing debate these days. That's of course easily said and then easier said than done, as we know, right? It's not so easy to just put new trees and new forest into our cities, especially when they're very dense. But there are ways of doing that, and there's really an interesting development, I think, worldwide of very creative ways of bringing trees and forests back into cities. Infilling, for example, using smaller spaces or smaller, for example, former industrial sites, or even in some cases removing housing areas to put trees and parks in. Reclaiming land, for example, on garbage tips, as in the case of Seoul, Korea. Elevating forests, so taking the forest up a level, as for example, many of you will know, of course, the High Line, which is not a forest per se, but at least there's ideas there, of course, of bringing the forest up to a different level. And even putting trees on buildings, vertical forests. Transplanting forest, I'll show you an example of that in a second. But also rewilding. Studies by the US Forest Service show that actually where urban forests are expanding in North America and the United States is often actually natural recolonization of trees. And it's also about this kind of imaginative or imaginary forests. And what I mean with that is actually, it's not only about putting the trees in, it's also about creating or recreating the connections between people and trees to make sure that those ties are developed. Because if people are not interested in trees, they don't feel connected to them, they're also less inclined, of course, to support urban forestry programs or to actually be tree stewards themselves. So tools abound. Some of the interesting approaches that are emerging, for example, the Miyawaki or the tiny forest movement that came from Southeast Asia, from Japan and also India, where the idea is really to have a small area, put a very dense forest-like system in, so that you get rapid growth and rapid biomass, and then maybe over time start shaping that small miniature forest. Interesting and also heavily debated in terms of, okay, what's realistic? Is this really the best method? But it shows that actually as a tool, it really shows a new drive for innovation and looking at urban forest maybe in a novel and fresh way. And it really can connect then to some big picture urban development work. So this is Barcelona again. This is the so-called superblock idea. So Barcelona has this grid structure, especially in this what we call the Exemple area here north. This is the old downtown area. This is the harbor. So you see the grid structure here. So these blocks of 3 by 3 are actually being considered now as a super block, meaning that within the super block, these roads are going to be less trafficked. So it'll be more local traffic, it'll be more biking and walking. And then on the intersections between the different low traffic or soft traffic roads, there will be new squares where tree cover, tree planting is an important part of the strategy. So it means actually a kind of an internal, a very clever way of retrofitting the city with new green spaces, new public spaces, which of course also runs into all kind of barriers and all kind of, on the one hand, public support, but also public resistance in some ways, because people do love their cars and they do like to get to the places with their cars. Just to show you one example of how that looks in practice, this is the Passeig San Juan here in Barcelona. It used to be a heavily trafficked corridor and is now starting to become a linear, basically a linear park where there is still traffic, although only 2 lanes. There's a big bike track, and then on the sides, there's this really interesting new green space developing where people are allowed to do all kinds of activities. You see a little bit more of it. You see also things like rainwater infiltration, different tree layers, social meeting places, play spaces, different functions are being combined. So where you don't have the space, but you can start maybe reusing your street landscape that takes up quite a bit of the city, or the car habitat, as some people call it. This is in The Hague, in the Netherlands, where a good friend of mine, Jean-Paul Gaultier, is working to maybe retrofit some of the parks, this kind of typical wide open expanses of grass, to make them maybe a bit more interesting by putting some forest-like vegetation on the edges. So he's creating a new urban forest here, collaborating with the local neighborhood, but also with local schools, and then following also over time how this forest system is developing, trying to imitate natural conditions of surrounding dune vegetation, and then really closely monitoring how, for example, the soil microbiota so are developing over time as well. So really interesting experiment, I think, of bringing this forest thinking back into the city. And of course, there's some really iconic projects of reclaimed land. Partly, this is the Gardens by the Bay in Singapore, that has become this huge attraction for many people. So the urban forest becomes an economic driver in some cases even. And of course, the High Line in New York is another example of that. And I already said you can sometimes put the forest up vertically, but you can also, of course, put people over the forest. And this is in Fuzhou in China, where I've been working quite a bit. And here they made this overpass structure where people can actually start enjoying this mountain forest, this hillside forest, which is not always easily accessible, in a much more interesting way. And of course, also this helps to connect people and trees in novel ways. And I already mentioned the vertical forest. This is the iconic Bosco Verticale in Milano, where Stefano Boeri, the architect, envisioned the idea that why do trees have to grow on the ground, right? Or even on roofs? We can actually put them on the side of buildings, on balconies. And of course, this has a lot of interesting challenges in terms of management, maintenance, irrigation, dealing with wind effects. But this model has now been replicated in, I think, close to 50 cities worldwide where these kind of vertical forests are being developed. Countries like the Netherlands, but also North America, and of course, not surprisingly, maybe in China, there's a lot of these projects now being run out. Yeah, and I mentioned the transplanting. This is a really interesting project in Tokyo called the Otamachi Tower Project. This is a site in the CBD of Tokyo, really very, very dense, very high buildings. And several companies there were willing to put in new buildings and to add a few floors to the buildings. The one condition they were given was actually you had to create some green space as well. And rather than maybe just putting in the usual park-like structure, they actually worked to make it more interesting. And they said, well, we want to have a forest-like experience. So they engaged with experts and they established a forest outside of Tokyo. They let it grow for a few years, established the soil, vegetation structure. And then after a few years, cut up that forest into pieces and brought it into the city by train and truck and reestablished it on the side. So a real transplantation effort. And of course, it required some work after that. But after a very few years, there was really this feeling already of a forest experience. So office workers would come out, sit there, have their lunch, and really feel that they're in a completely different setting. I had the pleasure to be there a few years ago, and it really gives you the impression that you're in a small forest system. You hear bird song and you see insects, etc. So a pretty successful effort, obviously coming at quite a cost, right? This is hundreds of millions of US dollars that were invested in this project. And then this kind of rewilding focus is really interesting to follow in countries like China. So I've had the pleasure to go there quite often during the recent years. And you see a trend now in China that some of these more traditional, very high maintenance parks are being transitioned into forest-like parks. And this is based on the initiative of President Xi and other high-level politicians who say, well, we want to bring the forest back into the city. We want to make sure that people have forest experiences, even when they live in a huge city like Beijing. So of course, Chinese style, this can go very quick, overnight, basically, in a few years' time or even less. A multi-layered structure is created with many different tree species. And this is one example, the Guangyangong Valley Park close to Tiananmen Square in Beijing. Again, a lot of discussions here, of course, about sustainability. We did some work with students here from Beijing Forestry University, trying to figure out, okay, over the longer term, how are we going to develop a sustainable system? As you see already here, in the picture here, there are, of course, some issues with tree mortality. And so when these big trees go in. And then it can always get bigger in terms of investment, in terms of project scale. So this is Green Riyadh in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, a city, that currently has a canopy cover of less than 1%. Yeah, less than 1% tree canopy, about 1.5% green space cover. So obviously, this is a city in need of some rethinking. It's heavily dominated by cars. Of course, the country is heavily relying on oil industry, petroleum industry. So the rulers have said that we have to make a radical shift, and it has to happen quick. So we have to move into a green economy. We have to move into a way of urban living that actually will be attractive for tourists as well. So the Green Riyadh project is allegedly, I think, a 50 billion project to green the city in different ways by establishing new parks, by raising the canopy cover up to 10 or maybe 15%. And of course, being in a desert like Riyadh is, that requires a lot of thinking in terms of what species to use, how to use, for example, wastewater. So right now, the city only uses about 15% of its wastewater, recycles that. So 85% of the water is lost. So trying to recapture at least part of that actually creates opportunities also for establishing vegetation. And the interesting thing is, it's not only these big iconic projects, but it's actually also targeting local projects around mosques and schools, trying to really bring the benefits of trees and the benefits of green space into this social fabric, into the neighborhoods, as we also heard Carly talk about earlier. But again, all the good intentions can be there, but we're still also facing, of course, in many places, a loss of canopy. This is my own university campus, University of British Columbia, where we have had tremendous trees on campus, huge Douglas firs, huge Western red cedars, etc. But a lot of these trees have fallen victim over time to the development of the university and of the campus. And as a little bit of a sad antidote, this art project was created a couple of years ago. This is the shade of a Douglas fir tree, and I really hope we're not moving in that direction with our cities. So I really hope that we will take green space a little bit more seriously. All right, so we're heading into the last part of the talk. And you've seen a lot of these big projects, iconic projects, right? There's a lot of things happening. And of course, it's not only about those big iconic projects. It's also about the smaller ideas, the smaller innovations, the connection between people, the connection between ideas that really can make a big difference. I've shown this slide a few times before, but really there's so many interesting things happening in our field, from equipment being developed, for example, for female arborists that always had to do with equipment that was based on man, right? And we know in general, of course, in society, there's a huge problem with the fact that in many of our designs, in many of our research studies, in medicine, etc., men have often been the default. So it means that a lot of the adaptations have to be made towards women these days, obviously. And that's really starting to happen also in our industry. Things like new types of ordinances, legislation, new ways of presenting management plans, but also innovations around tree establishment, to communication tools, of course. Many of these ideas are actually thriving. So maybe it's actually almost so that we can talk about a renaissance in urban forestry, right? This is really a golden age for urban forestry, potentially, if we play our cards right and keep innovating and keep collaborating as partners across industry, across municipalities and other governments, and also across civic society, because it really requires a joint effort. And that this imaginary forest, I mentioned it, right? This kind of keeping people connected to trees is really a big part of that. Really nice illustration here by Kathy Benenbow. It was part of a paper by Townsend and Barton. Kind of really nicely shows that people may have tried to leave the trees behind them, and of course, they keep embracing them. So we keep trees close to us as society has progressed, we can maybe say. Other people will say it may deteriorated. We can see what you feel about it. But in any case, we have kept trees close to us. And of course,
5 more minutes.
Yeah, thank you. And books like Richard Powers' book, The Overstory, really make really nice connections between people and trees. So that relates kind of things to stewardship. How do we bring people and trees together? How do we make sure this is actually going to work in practice? And that's always easier said than done, as we know. So that may require also kind of a paradigm shift, and not just saying that nature is nice to have and nature will solve our problems, but actually giving nature more space, right? This kind of nature-based thinking approach that we've tried to promote together with a group of authors led by Professor Thomas Randrup, to say, well, in some cases, actually nature needs to have more freedom. It needs to be more cyclical. We need to give more space to ecological processes, which in some ways can be a little bit scary maybe for us controlling urban areas. And that ties in then to work like Professor Suzanne Simard's work on the fact that trees communicate on the ground. They exchange information, nutrients, even between different species. And her work is, of course, now featured in this book, Finding the Mother Tree. And that thinking, of course, that new, novel ecological thinking should be brought into our cities in a nature-based thinking approach. And then we get young entrepreneurial researchers and experts like Sophie Nitaslavsky and Nadine Galle, who are starting to talk about things like the Internet of Nature and smart urban forestry in really interesting approach as well. So, and COVID, of course, has definitely helped with that, kind of getting a refocus, reappreciation on some of these issues as well. I won't go into too much detail here. So education is key. I mentioned that earlier, right? So we are lucky, of course, that there's a lot of interesting new initiatives, short-term education, leadership education, new master programs that are really helping to make sure we keep growing in this potential renaissance for urban forestry. And then finally, my final few slides are dealing then with, okay, can we provide some kind of easy guidelines? Many of you are familiar with, especially when you have kids, I guess, the 5-second rule, true or not, but of course, all of us will know about 10, 20, 30, Frank Santimore's rule for tree diversity. And the funny thing is that even though the research behind this may not be so strong, it sticks, right? People really realize 10, 20, 30, something to remember. Not more than 10% of the same species, not more than 20% of the same genus, not more than 30% of the same family. So in that vein then, after many years of kind of resisting giving very simple guidelines or rules, I came up with this 330-300 rule, basically saying that everybody should see at least 3 trees from their window. Every neighborhood should have at least 30% canopy cover, and we should not live more than 300 meters away from our park, nearest park. And that relates to some of the research I showed you earlier, that Carly showed you earlier, about health impacts, climate change impacts, and the stimulation we actually have of using green spaces when we live pretty close. So this is how it looks in my case, right? So I have quite some trees to see. Canopy cover is pretty decent in the street, and I don't have to walk more than 300 meters to the nearest green space. And interesting enough, a city in Denmark called Frederiksberg says that you should actually be able to see at least 1 tree from your window if you live in that city. So it's not a very original idea in that sense. And then you can start, of course, looking at things like greenness of street scenes. You can start actually, by modern technology, start assessing the green view that people have from where they live and work. You can also start assessing this 30% canopy cover. This is in the Netherlands, where the green areas have 30% canopy or more in neighborhoods. And as you see, the picture is unfortunately pretty grim, especially realizing that most of the big cities are here in the west of the country. And you have to get it right, but just putting a lot of green in can also backfire. This is the Bijlmer, Amsterdam Southeast, where a lot of green was put in, but a ghetto actually developed over time because some of the local design and placemaking was not done properly. So it's always a combination, of course, of different factors. And then, yeah, basically, of course, where you are in the world, Barcelona, Riyadh, Vancouver, it will be different in how you implement these 330-300. Sometimes it will not be 30% trees, it may be 30%, or some trees and also some other vegetation that's more context specific or context sensitive. And it can be done. This is one of my final slides here, showing that cities like Malmö, Kaunas, and Utrecht in Europe, actually you see here close to 80%, 70 to 80% of all people right now already live within 300 meters of the nearest public green space. Yeah, so this is circling around social media, which is pretty interesting and pretty unexpected, because I said usually urban forestry research is not so exciting, but these kind of simple rules are being picked up and can be a vehicle for actually communicating some of our maybe more nuanced messages. So I'm optimistic, be it 330-300 or being some of the really exciting work that we see being done, and you heard some really great work today, that I think we're actually on a trajectory with urban forestry, that we are more relevant, we are being mainstreamed. But of course, we can never be complacent. We'll have to be proactive, we have to be communicative, and we also have to make sure we keep the evidence flowing as well, because whatever we do, of course, will always be judged on the basis of our work. So with that, I would like to thank you for listening.
Thank you, Cecil, for your excellent presentation and for all that you do for the field of urban forestry. Links for obtaining SAF, ISA, LTE, and ASLA CUs are now in the chat box. And then I'll now switch to the questions and answers portion of the presentation. So there's a number of questions. The first one, are you seeing municipalities using biophilic tools as adequate means of addressing climate change and lack of green space, or is this more of a trendy dodge to placate environmentalists?
Yeah, that's a good question, of course. I do think there are cities that are municipalities that are doing it. And I think also in some cases they're doing it with the heart and mind in the right place. There are quite some examples, for example, here in Europe, of cities that are really thinking in biophilic ways, that are trying to integrate green in building design and green spaces. There's always a risk, of course, with the terminology and the kind of hipness of the term nature-based solutions and biophilia, that these terms get hijacked. So again, that's, I think, where we as experts have to go in and make sure the delivery, the actual implementation is done, and hold municipalities accountable for the promises they make.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Next question is linking to Dr. Smith's mycorrhizal importance. While rewilding projects in cities be more successful by inoculation and attention to soils?
That's a very good question. I'm not an expert on that, so I know there's a little bit of debate about it. I know some people say yes, other people say it's not needed. I do know, of course, based on the work of Suzanne Semart and others, that there's really a lot we don't really understand about how trees grow in urban areas, and we've tended often to put them in kind of boxes or not to think about what's happening between trees. So I think we have to think much more, even along streets, in terms of building systems, ecological systems, where trees have chances to integrate or to communicate and interact.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that. A question that was also asked is how did you come up with the 330-300 rule?
Yeah, I did it. I gave a very brief introduction to it, but the idea was really to kind of link the best evidence, the work by people like Carly Zeiter, for example, that was really going to the canopy link, but also work from Australia that shows that a 30% canopy cover is kind of that threshold for getting a lot of mental and physical health benefits. And the same with the 300-meter distance thing, which was actually pretty well established already by World Health Organization. So the kind of innovation here is the visible tree part, which we haven't really integrated. And of course, then you can say, well, do you need to see 1 tree, 3 trees, 5 trees? We know the more green you see, in principle, the better. But then, of course, 330-300 has a good ring to it. So it's also, it is a communication tool, obviously. Sure, but there's evidence. There's evidence behind it, I think, to back it up. And I can feel strongly enough to say that I can stand for it, at least as a principle.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Are there some communities of jurisdictions that you feel have really implemented that rule, or at least parts of it?
They're starting, yeah. So of course, it's very new. I launched this in February of this year. There are now several cities in Canada and the UK that actually have adopted it formally. The district of Saanich on Vancouver Island formally adopted it. Of course, I'm going to monitor and closely see how it's actually being rolled out. Again, it could be a nice way to greenwash some of the activities people are doing. So of course, I hope that they actually implement it as a positive tool. It's also nice to see that international organizations, not-for-profits, have started to implement it as a principle. For example, Greenpeace Spain ran a campaign for greening of cities, but they say, well, at least 330-300 should be adopted in all Spanish cities, for example. So it is being picked up, but it's still early days.
Great, thank you. There's a question regarding the car that you showed in one of your slides. Was the vegetation real? How does it stay alive?
That's a very good question. Yeah. I think it was not. I think it was a promotion car. I think it was for. I don't even know if it was a green roofs or something else. But of course, it shows a little bit this idea that even a car can be greened, even though, of course, in this case, it's not a live vegetation. It's just a gimmick. But it shows a little bit this interesting connection between vegetation and cars that can sometimes even be seen.
Appreciate it. Thank you. There's another question regarding how can cities better incorporate urban forest as a solution in climate action plans and policies? And maybe if you could also give some examples of cities that are doing this.
Yeah, this is a great question. We actually did a study in Canada led by a PhD student called Cindy Cheng at UBC, British Columbia. And she studied both urban forestry strategies and climate plans and strategies in the 20 largest Canadian cities. And it turned out, unfortunately, there was very, very little alignment between these plans. And there was especially very little reference to urban forestry in climate plans. There were a few cities, I think Halifax was one of them in Nova Scotia, that actually had done it. And of course, you can make quite some big gains by aligning these two important strategies and plans. So we're doing work in Birmingham, UK right now, where we actually also try to really connect urban forest and climate action. And there's other cities in Sweden, etc., that are also really aware of this challenge.
Okay, so that's the last question that was posted. So thanks again for your presentation, Cecil, and again for all that you do for the field of urban forestry.
Thanks for having me.